really appreciate that ending on compassionate communication, because I would like to kind of use that as a springboard, I think, to jump into the roundtable. What I really gathered from all of the speakers today, and I thank you all, such a wonderful contribution, and these are the voices I really think are just so vital to this conversation, is this idea that you're trying to communicate, but everyone was, of kind of like deep listening, radical listening, respecting others and not treating others like they're idiotic, misinformed, less than, because this really doesn't contribute to not just compassion. It's not even really a part of compassion, but certainly not any practical change. So how I'm going to use as an example, and then I'll kind of pivot to a question that was first given towards Pratik, is that, you know, in a paper by Breeze Harper, she talks about the difference between racism and racialized consciousness, that we have to be quick to understand that there might be obviously people who are racist out there, but a lot of us just walk around with racialized consciousness. Jane Elliott used to talk about this, that said, if you grow up in the United States and you're not racist, the school system failed you. And her idea was that if you grew up in the US, it's racialized already. And I think that's kind of the better. And I think the why I'm giving these examples is that it also pivots into our relationship to animals. It pivots into our relationship to those of different classes and different genders and so on. So as just a kind of a high level interjection, there's a question to Pratik that says, in India, people are accustomed to milk and dairy products since childhood. They don't think there's anything wrong with dairy consumption. So this is how I'm kind of pivoting here. I think there's a kind of consciousness that's just inherited, right? Anthropocentralized consciousness, you could say. And so this is the question. They don't think there's anything wrong with dairy consumption. So how do you go about convincing these people, Pratik?
So two points about that. One is like from my own experience, what doesn't help is, and again, that's my perspective, what doesn't help is just like going after people in a way that's like, that sounds violent and aggressive, because at the end of the day, we need to realize that we are representing the animals. So we need to have like a responsible representation, right? And what helps is, most of the times is, let's say if you're in a village in India, right? Just taking whoever you're trying to like convince, or whoever you're trying to share the information with, just taking them to like almost any dairy farm in India. You will see something that sounds like compassion, that looks compassionate, but then you will see a calf that is tied either next to the mother or away from the mother. Something that you won't accept if that was done to a human being. And then again, it's most of the times it's like you lead your way, you talk about things. For example, in my wedding, I made it a point to have a vegan wedding, right? You do keep doing educational sessions. I mean, to unfortunately, the only way forward, and like legal disruptions is disruptions is one part of it. You get involved, that's one part of it. But when it really comes down to like special like family members and people around us, I think like letting the victims do the talking is probably like the best thing, at least that I've noticed, and it works. Like just a small video that you take, and that helps.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to pivot to another question, and this is also a roundtable. So our guests, if you want to put things in the chat to me for your kind of co-participants, I can clearly allow that to happen as well. So here is another comment from Agni Hogabum, one of our other master's students. Thank you, Ankith, Pratik, Hetali, and I'm sure Arpit as well. This question came in before the last presentation. These are wonderful presentations. Every single minute was valuable and informative. For any panelist who wants to answer, I want to ask a question about religious privilege. For the ethical vegetarian who decides to give up dairy, won't there be a spiritual grieving process? What they once felt justified in doing, or even holy in doing, is now being revealed to be cruel and unnecessary. How can a spiritual practitioner best navigate the way this may place them as an outsider from their social and or religious or faith group? And just to make this more general, I think also Hetali probably would have something to say here, is in general, what happens when you kind of start to develop a consciousness that's more inclusive, that goes against your, say, conservative group with respect to, say, systemic racism? How do you deal with stigmatization, becoming an outsider, and navigate that? But I guess maybe we could start if Ankith or Pratik want to start, because the question was started with vegetarianism and veganism, but I think we could really expand that to other issues here as well. Ankith, I don't know if you want to speak or Pratik on this. Ankith.
Yeah, so I think like on any of these issues, and not just about vegetarianism or like not just about veganism, I think the first thing is to like cope with our own discomfort, right? The fact that we are getting discomfort, it's like we have our own like boundaries and we have our own privileges that has been hit. Basically, someone is like kind of attacking us, right? So I think the first step is like to look at that and to grieve, take a moment to understand that we have been in the position of like oppressors, not necessarily individually, but just as a system. And then the next part has to be like the spiritual grieving part, where the best part, like, you know, the best way of possibly grieving is like grieving with the victims, trying to shed light on what's happening, and then we are the ones who will be in the best position to talk to our community. So I think like the best way of grieving is to like forgive ourselves, and through like, you know, in a way in which we kind of also like either not like really uplift but share the experiences of the ones who are suffering, may it be like people from the oppressed communities, may it be animals. I mean, I don't see like a way around like, you know, grieving just by like sitting and like not doing anything about it. But maybe Hetali, Ankith, Arpit might have something more to add.
Yeah, I think that was, thank you for that, Pratik. I think to add on, I think there, especially in Jainism, with the idea of forgiveness, and there's also this idea of self-compassion, giving compassion to yourself. And I think as part of that grieving process, there's also a sort of mind shift that usually occurs. It's occurred with me, I'm pretty sure with everyone else too. Of in like when we found ourselves in these situations, I think understanding that I think the problem, like whether it's, you know, what like whatever the injustice is, it's too big to really kind of stop and think of, oh, like what about what I've done in the past versus, you know, think about like being forward looking and actually trying to take necessary steps to make sure that you're not contributing to those injustices, and and by that I mean any sort of them. But I know Hetali probably can talk more about the racial justice aspect of it.
I mean, so the first thing that I want to say is that I really empathize, right? Like I think that I have and still do experience a ton of cognitive dissonance, particularly actually in like chain youth spaces when I'm confronted with those moments, or am sort of in a conversation or have an example in front of me of the fact that like everything that I just talked about of how these concepts fit together with my understanding of my faith so clearly, that's like 100% not how some people see it, right? Like they think everything that I just said is like something that I made up to like make myself feel good about my like personal and political or whatever views, and it just like it doesn't compute for them in the same way at all. And I think that that grieving that you speak of is pretty natural because um I think for so many of us, religion and spirituality is actually about more than just our individual path. It's about community, right? Like we grew up like going to these spaces and going to classes, and if we're honest with ourselves, if we were like going to religious study classes growing up, it was like just as much to hang out with our friends as it was to like learn things. And so then to find out that there's tension in those spaces is really hard. And I think that the way that I try to work through it is to not take up the job as much as possible of like it being my role to convince anybody of anything. Like my role, as I see it, is to live my life the best way that I know how, and always be an open place for like dialogue and conversation. And if that is a space that somebody feels safe exploring in or sort of pushing back on or talking about, like awesome. That will maybe get us somewhere. But it's really hard. I just want to affirm that.
Thanks. Arpit, would you like to kind of join this? Do you have anything
Yeah.
you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I think the last part of the question, how can spiritual practitioner best navigate the way this may place them as an outsider in the social or religious faith group? So I think there are two parts to it. One is, our approach to or how we are thinking in terms to others and how others are thinking together as collective, as a group against our or for our thought. So when I am, kind of propagating an idea or thinking about others as a community, I'm always thinking that the core idea of compassion derives from everybody has a soul and everybody is as alive as we are. Everybody's a jiva, right? And then the state of the soul which they are currently in doesn't define that infinite power or infinite compassion which the soul has. So I think that at this point of the time, they may be in a different thought process, but with time, eventually there would be a realization. And even if it is not, my job as a person who believes in this idea, I need to practice this for me. And if I am not able to convince others about it, I'm not going to push them, because that state or that point of time, they have a different thought. So avoiding conflict, always, as Hetali said, open to dialogue, that helps. And then the second part is community is not always thinking of us as an outsider, even if we are having a different perspective. It could be one or two person which may be driving a narrative there, but if you think about like 60 to 70% or 80% or 90% of the people, they're all compassionate. And I was giving that example when we were supporting Caden for, towards a role into the movie. So majority of them are not thinking what we are listening through our ears. They're all okay with your practices. Some of them who are trying to propagate their beliefs are the ones who you're hearing for. So community is very accepting of things, and we may not know it, but it's important to keep that in perspective.
And just a last quick comment, I think like finding safe spaces for ourselves within the community also helps a lot for sure.
Great. So another question here, it's kind of in response to a comment I made, but I think it's kind of great for the panel. It says from Samyak Jain, great point about racialized consciousness. Do you therefore, so I'm going to ask the panel here, do you therefore think elements of racism, sexism, classism, etc., are inevitable in human society, and for the fact that they may activate tribal centers deeper to us than cognified equality principles can access? So I think this is a question that's kind of, are there ways in which these are inevitable? Are we seeing these as kind of new manifestations? And I guess ultimately, how do we deconstruct these forms of consciousness? And then also, I think, as Hetali spoke about, and then there's a comment in the chat as well about how do we actually transfer it horizontally to other issues? I think this is kind of the question maybe for the panel. I could use this. How do we feel like we really are dialed into one issue, but then there's kind of a wall up when we're trying to go horizontally across. And I would say that this goes both ways. This happens with people who are animal advocates who seem to not want to engage with human justice issues. And then there's an issue with human justice issues that just have a problem sliding horizontally into animal issues. So I guess, what are your thoughts on maybe the reasons for some of these and how we might be able to move through them compassionately?
I could say sort of two things. I think the first is that I do think to some extent these beliefs, these like patterns of behaving and being in the world are baked into our systems like that. I think we've all touched on in one way or another how that's where some of this starts. And the only solution that I have ever sort of seen, if we're going to generalize to that, is that learning, is being willing to actively learn more about that, to speak with others, to learn from people who have lived experiences that are different than yours, and to begin to better understand. And through that understanding, you may be able to kind of address one or more of those starting positions that you're coming from, just because like we are all socialized creatures. I also think it's a huge ask of ourselves to expect all of our actions to be sort of ethically and morally aligned all the time. So I think the comment along the lines of like, so am I just like am I a hypocrite? Like what is this even worth if I can't do all of it? You're doing more than none of it, I think. And I like, there's things that I do, I know on a day-to-day basis that are perhaps if I were to extrapolate the kind of fullest range of some of the things that I talked about today, you know, maybe it's not in line with that. But I am only a human and I do only have limited capacity. So I think it's good to be cognizant of that. I think it's good to recognize the ways in which maybe we could do more or could change something, but I think that is space for growth, and that's great. I don't think that has to mean that you're not doing anything that matters or mean that, you know, you should feel defeated or somehow ashamed. Like this is a process. It isn't something that you flip a switch on and all of a sudden you're behaving in a more enlightened way.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it reminds me of a wonderful phrase from Desai, who's an anthropologist at the University of Toronto, who also writes absolutely beautifully on animals, and not just animals, but she refers to it as the tyranny of consistency. Like it just becomes tyrannical, whereas, and then what happens, right? And then there's finger pointing in some aspect of your life that is less kind of resolved, and then it's just an argument that seems to be doing no productive work whatsoever, right? And then we get back to the same stereotype of say one's ethics or even their veganism as being like a purely kind of ascetic or purity practice, which is certainly antithetical to social justice, if that's the framing. So anyone else want to weigh in? Pratik or Arpit? I see you're ready.
Hey, Arpit, I can go after you.
Oh, so I think you know, in the core idea of whether it is inevitable to be having these thoughts, I think the biggest example which comes in my mind, and coming from more of a scientific perspective, like thinking that there's a logical hypothesis, what is the evidence we have for or against it? So Bhagwan Mahavir, he is the embodiment of, you know, how somebody actually overcome those, you know, barriers which were restricting us to see things in a very you know, very biased way. So it's yes, it is inherent to our society. We carry a lot of inherited, you know, DNA, not only from the science perspective, but also in our thoughts and culture. So a lot of inheritance has come, and times were different, but we have stuck to some of the things which, you know, eventually, like think about like ancient times when the wars were happening between the tribes. You know, the other tribes were considered bad, but eventually now that it's unified into a different country, those divides are still existing, whether it's religion, etc. So yes, it is hard, but it's not impossible to actually eventually get away from them. So you know, our rooted you know, response system can be changed by being conscious and by being aware of what our thoughts and progresses are.
And just to add, right, like there is a big difference between having contradictions and hypocrisy, right? We are going to have contradictions. The best way forward is to make sure we keep taking a stock of situation and we try giving our best, like, you know, not contribute to it in the first place. And the second question, where there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that all the social injustices will either go away, or if they do go away for a bit, you know, they'll stay, like, you know, they'll stay away in a sustained way, or that new ones won't, like, you know, become visible to us. But the only or the best way forward is to try to make it a better place, try to elevate them. And if, like, the least is, at least we end up creating support spaces where when people and groups suffer, we at least have places where they can speak up, where they get support, right? So yes, there's no evidence that it will go away, but there is 100% like evidence that if we do nothing about it, it's either going to stay or going to get worse, you know.
Yeah, I think adding on, I think Hetali, in your presentation, you mentioned how this idea of staying and practicing Jainism within community within, and how I think that is a lot more of an ongoing, like, learning, engaged process. It's not just a, you know, you've accomplished one thing, now you're done. It's ongoing, and and you have to keep putting in the work, and you have to, for your own progress, and especially again when you're engaging with in practicing Jainism within a community framework, as opposed to removing yourself from society and practicing it on like a solitary path. I think that you mentioned that was really interesting. So thank you for that. Yeah.
So there's some other comments in the kind of questions in the Q&A that have been answered a lot about kind of making incremental change and this kind of, issue of practically how can we expect certain things from people, especially once we acknowledge the depth, either in some kind of transgenerational way, or even if it's just a kind of social conditioning, it's very deep to deconstruct these programs we're running on. And in that vein, I actually want to pivot something that one of our instructors, Vasily Stanescu, says a lot, and I really have learned this from him, and I try to repeat it as much as possible to myself, which is that like we're all victims in one way or another of certain forms of conditioning, whether it's racial thinking or thinking about animals, or being like pummeled with advertisements, or pummeled with desire, kind of production satisfaction. And that, listening to Arpit's talk, this seems to be critical for compassionate listening and having dialogues, because it seems like once we make a change, we kind of lose compassion for the person we used to be in those conversations, when it's sometimes precisely the person we should be compassionate towards. And given Hetali's talk, I think that one of the most amazing ways that I've seen this practice is in, say, Black liberation movements, who talk about things like white supremacy, and they turn to white people and say, like, this is also killing you. Like, we're not the only victims here. I mean, you're also the victims of it. And like the amount of compassion it takes to say that, to say the oppressor in a sense, and say, this is also killing you and harming you, and we have compassion for it. So I'm trying to thinking about ways, whether it's in animal issues or racism, again, ways in which you think we can put that into practice. In the last 5 minutes or so, if you maybe give examples from your own worlds, ways you think we can really exercise this form of compassion, say in the local Jain community, or outside of it. Because I think people really like to have like practical things to move with when they leave a panel. We're talking about ideas for a long time. So any kind of recommendations or tips?
Sort of immediate one that comes to my mind is actually a conversation that I had with a friend the other day around having compassion for your capacity, essentially. So not, recognizing what amount of time on news apps or on Instagram is going to start to eat away at you, and or make you feel a sort of like, oh, like I'm not at this protest, or I'm not doing this thing, or I didn't do that thing, and now I feel bad, or now I feel like I haven't done enough, or I'm not in it enough. And I think that that eats away at our capacity to do anything at all over time. And so being kind to ourselves and to others in terms of recognizing this work is so important, but it shouldn't be surprising as a corollary then that it's hard, and that the only way for people to be able to sustain doing that is if they feel the space and feel supported in being able to set appropriate boundaries. Like, it is okay if you don't know about everything that happened the moment it happened. It's okay if you don't show up to everything. It's okay if you ask for space and time sometimes.
Great. I think that really helps a lot, right? This kind of ubiquitous problem of burnout, right? That happens in groups where you have like a really short burst of activity, and then the recovery is double or triple that time. Any other thoughts from the other kind of panelists on kind of like tips for moving forward with these principles? How to get people to apply themselves while at the same time having compassion for their energy or their kind of acceptance in their communities?
It's also like, it's also the fact that it's not a sprint, right? It's a big marathon. Like when we look at like historical progress that we might have made, we talk about it in like very simplistic terms. Hey, we achieved this in the 18th century, this in the 19th century, this in the 20th century. But if you just go into that era and look at it, those time spans from a human life scale perspective, those are huge. Like some of these progresses have taken like long enough that someone's like grandparent was born, and by the time this particular person is dead, at that point you have like certain voting rights. So just to expect that something's going to happen in our lifetime is not necessarily realistic, right? And also the other part is taking rest and not burning out from fatigue is also a part of the progress. Like, I mean, if all of us just end up getting fatigued and burnt out, nothing's going to move forward. And there's also always like many avenues in which we can help. Someone might not be able to go to a protest, right? So for example, someone who is not able to stand or walk or travel might be able to do a lot of things in some educational space. So there's like a lot of things that we can do. Again, there's a lot of rest that we should be taking, and acknowledging that this is going to take, and this always takes like generations, if not like, if not like millennials, it at least takes generations.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I think this is not like a material thing, like, building a home or doing something like very like that has an end goal. It's an ongoing process. And as I think we've talked about through our different presentations, throughout different points in history, throughout different points in Jainism, I think, problems kind of see themselves kind of fixing and coming back in different means and measures. And so it's definitely an ongoing process. I think for me, something that really works is, and this is kind of my sort of personal view on Ekantvad and how maybe if this helps with any like with anyone having this issue, is I think Ekantvad can be used in also just amplifying other voices in your own life, and reading a certain author that you otherwise may not know, and hearing their perspective, I think, is very critical. And again, just the ongoing learning process and learning other perspectives through this. I think it's a big collective effort, and so it is not, I think, like on one person for sure. But we also want to make sure that each of us do our own part, that makes us be compassionate towards ourselves, but towards others and other souls as well.
Yep. And to add to that, I think, Jonathan, as you were mentioning that, sometimes being or asking people to be compassionate is actually being compassionate to them as well. You were outlining that thought. And one anecdote which comes to my mind specifically, and I'm really, I think Bhagwan Mahavir is my idol, because I, kind of go back and see in the anecdotes which we share, what did he do in some of the stories which I know. And then there was a story in which he goes to a place and then people are pelting stones at him. They're really not liking the idea of him being present. And he's like, what do I do? Like, you stay here, you try to educate them, or what do you want to do? And he realized that the thoughts are pretty strong. And he meditated and thought that I don't want to be the reason for them to be angry and add to their karmas of hatred. So if I replace myself from this position, I can actually let their thoughts simmer down and let them not have bad karma associated with it. So it was such a beautiful message. Even when we're interacting with sometimes communities where there is a lot of resistance, a lot of thoughts which are opposite to us, it's okay to retract. It's okay to take a few steps back, gather your energies, fill your cup, and then engage in a less intense environment and that. So I think it works both ways. You're not only being compassionate to yourself, but by disengaging, you're also being compassionate to other person by not giving them a reason over there. And it's kind of like a hard to think in that dimensions, but I think we have so many examples in our tradition which reflect this kind of thought process.
Well, thank you all so much. I just want to end on a couple of things that were in the chat and the Q&A. One, someone asked, who's working on a Jain liberation theology and how can we help? So I'm just like hoping that this is something that we continue to do. And I would say that what we do at Arihanta and Engage Jain Studies is not synonymous, but it's in the same spirit, right? We're talking in the same language. And I'd like to end on a comment here from Mayar Lodaya, who wrote, I would like to post a small comment. I am heartened hearing this discourse. Our youth has an open heart and practices Ankantavad, compassion, and other key principles of Jain teaching in a very open and inclusive manner. Many thanks to all of the panelists and organizers. So I think this is a wonderful way to end this roundtable on compassion and social justice, and really seeing how we are trying to bridge this gap. And I want to thank Ankith, Arpit, Hetali, and Pratik for joining. This has been a fantastic panel. So thank you all so much.